Welcome, everybody, to another Road to Wellness webinar series today. We're going to talk today about biosimilars. And my name is Kathy Olewski. I'm the Road to Wellness webinar host. I'm a patient, just like many of you, living with ANCA vasculitis. I was diagnosed in 2008, and I'm in remission and have been in remission off treatment for 7 years. So today I'd like to introduce our speaker, Dr. Kevin Byram. He's the co-director of the Vanderbilt Vasculitis Clinic. He's an assistant professor of medicine in the Division of Rheumatology at Vanderbilt University School of Medicine in Nashville, Tennessee. And with that, I would like to introduce Dr. Byram and let him tell us a lot about biosimilars, and we'll have some questions after he informs us of all the things we need to know about biosimilars. Welcome, Dr. Byram.
Thanks, Kathy. It's a pleasure to be here. Always is. I appreciate the Vasculitis Foundation giving me the time to educate patients. One of my favorite things to do. This is quite a complex topic we'll talk about today, biosimilars. But it's an emerging and very important topic in medicine and in the treatment of most traumatic diseases, and in particular vasculitis. So let's see here. I'm going to advance my slides. I don't have any financial disclosures. I will say I usually speak when I'm giving talks like this with so-called generic medicine names. Because of the topic today, I'm going to be using some brand names, but I'll be very clear about when I'm doing that. I want the patients to hold in their minds these guiding questions. I will answer some of these, most of these, I think, but I think many of these, it requires a discussion between the patient and their actual provider to decide whether or not a biosimilar is right for them. But, what is a biosimilar? Are biosimilars the same thing as generics? Why are biosimilars important? How effective are they? Do they go through the same process of approval by the FDA? Why is my doctor using a biosimilar drug in my treatment? And then are there any cost savings? This is a very nice kind of summary slide looking at biologics and biosimilars and comparing and contrasting those with our traditional drugs, what we'll call chemical drugs, and which have generics. If you go to the market at the pharmacy and buy acetaminophen or ibuprofen, many patients with ANCA vasculitis are told not to take ibuprofen, or omeprazole. These are what we call chemical drugs. They're very simple in some sense in terms of their structure. They are chemically produced in a lab. There's a very standardized cookbook type of method to produce them. And in the end, it's very possible to produce exactly the same molecule. And that's what we call a generic after the patent expires after so many years. These medicines tend to be stable, and patients typically don't react to them in terms of kind of producing antibodies to them. They're very kind of simple molecules. And there's a drawing up here of what's called cetirizine, and that's Zyrtec. On the other side of the slide here, we have infliximab, which is FDA approved to treat rheumatoid arthritis. Off-label, it's used sometimes to treat large vessel vasculitis like Takayasu's, but it's a very complex molecule, a lot of intense folding there. It's very complex. These are molecules that are produced by living cells and in a very kind of specialized manufacturing process. And the analogy that I think is useful here is, whereas there's kind of this cookbook type of lab type of method to create these chemical drugs, creating biologic drugs is a lot like making bread. Yeah, there are recipes to make bread, but anybody that's made bread before knows that each batch is a little bit different. That bread rises a little bit more this time or that time compared to the temperature or the atmospheric pressure. And thusly, there's some expected and anticipated variability between batches. And we're going to revisit that idea. These molecules tend to be very sensitive to storage, and patients can develop antibodies to them. And just the complexity of the molecules themselves has forced our governing bodies, particularly the FDA, to highly regulate these since they are complex to make. We're going to come back to a lot of these ideas. The next portion of this talk is we're going to kind of go through definitions. The idea of biosimilars really revolves around the definitions that the governing bodies have put out there. And we're going to start at the ground level here. Biologic products are those that are produced by living organisms. It's quite a diverse category of products, and we think about them being used to treat and cure disease, but ultimately they might be used to diagnose or prevent disease. And like I said, there is some variance expected because of how these molecules are produced. Some examples are the monoclonal proteins monoclonal antibodies that patients with rheumatic diseases, including vasculitis, are treated with. Adalimumab, that's Humira, or rituximab, that's Rituxan. Many patients with vasculitis are used or have that in their treatment regimen. But some vaccines like influenza and tetanus and other therapeutic proteins like filgrastim, these are molecules that help the bone marrow do their thing. It's important to understand, this is a very important point, that biosimilars are not generics. For reasons that we've really talked about, these are highly complex molecules, difficult to reproduce identically, and thus these are proteins that undergo an approval process to be demonstrated to be similar to the reference product. Well, I'm using a lot of terms there that we're going to come back to. The reference product is the molecule, the biologic product that is already approved by the FDA. And that means that it's undergone strict, rigorous approval process by the FDA on the basis of safety and effectiveness for its indications, those diseases that it is treated. So rituximab, for example, has been FDA approved for the treatment of ANCA vasculitis. It's also been studied in patients with rheumatoid arthritis and is approved for that. It's also been approved for several types of cancers. And what a biosimilar is it's a biologic product that has been demonstrated to be, quote, we're going to come back to these, highly similar to and have no clinically meaningful differences from the reference product. What do those terms mean? And again, these terms come straight from the FDA website. At the end, we're going to go over some resources that the patients can look at to further educate themselves. And that the FDA website is a really good one. So highly similar, what does that mean? So a manufacturer, they're wanting to make a biosimilar product, they need to go through a process by which they extensively analyze the structure and the function of both in their lab of both the reference product and their product, the biosimilar. And what they're doing is showing that they're basically very similar purity, chemical identity, and bioactivity. That's basically, so they're not testing it so much in patients right here, as much as just demonstrating the lab characteristics, showing that it's very, very similar. And the FDA has set out some ranges about the variance of the batches and what that means, but they're high standards. That no clinically meaningful difference. So if a manufacturer is wanting to produce a proposed biosimilar product, that's when they start testing it in patients that the reference product has been used to treat. And what they're showing there is that it has no clinically meaningful difference of safety, purity, potency, and effect. So you can rest assured the FDA has set out a process by which they measure these biosimilar products to make sure there's no variance in the chemical properties or an accepted narrow variance of chemical properties and clinical, in that there's no clinically meaningful differences. Now, there is this, under the umbrella of biosimilars, there's what we can call, I mean, it's controversial, this whole concept of interchangeable products, and we'll talk about that in a second, but we can call it the holy grail. You know, if there is a product that is so identical or so closely similar to the reference product that it really is, it's indistinguishable clinically. I think I want to lead with there are actually no current FDA approved interchangeable products that I know about at this time. There are some being tested, of course, but to be called an interchangeable product, not only does it have to meet those biologic, biosimilar standards, but there's some additional standards that Congress and the FDA has put out. But ultimately what it is these products need to be shown to have the same clinical result in any given patient. And additionally, the switch back and forth between reference product and the interchangeable product doesn't really matter. You can understand, I guess, let me put some specifics here. We'll go with the idea of rituximab. So rituximab, the reference product, it has been actually studied in patients with rheumatoid arthritis, ANCA vasculitis, and those cancers that I talked about. To become a biosimilar, a company really only has to take one or a few of those populations and demonstrate that it's highly similar to and no clinically important difference of. And then it can really be parlayed to be that biosimilar be approved for all the indications. Now, there's a lot of politics that go on there. And you'll see some of the biosimilars not approved for some of the indications, and it's based on patent law, basically. But you can understand, to get the interchangeable product label, a company would have to test their product in all of those populations, and they would have to do switching trials in all of those populations. It's very expensive. And that's why, as it stands, there are no so-called interchangeable products. Why are interchangeable products important? It's because if a medication, biosimilar, ever gets that label, the prescriber and thusly the patient don't have to be notified that it's being used. And that's where the controversy comes in. As it stands, if a patient is being given a biosimilar, the provider has to be notified of that by the pharmacy, by the insurance company. And that's, a lot of providers and patients think that's a really important thing, to know exactly what the patient is being given. So here are some biosimilars, and I bring this idea of rituximab up because I think this is one of the more common ones that our patients with ANCA vasculitis in particular are being treated with. The reference product is a product by a company called Genentech, and it's called Rituxan. But you can see that there are 3 other biosimilars. There's one by Pfizer called Prurience. There's one by Teva called Truxima, and there's one by Amgen called Ribani. And you can see the rituximab has a little interesting suffix, and that's how the FDA and the pharmacies kind of keep them apart. They're all called rituximab. And again, these are products that have been shown to be highly similar to, with no clinically meaningful difference to the reference product. I have had patients on all of these medications, and then it brings up the question of, why are these medicines being used? And this is a huge discussion, but it really comes down to the idea of cost and access. Many times an insurance company will work with what's called a pharmacy benefit manager and have a preference functionally for, they'll have a formulary of, all the patients on this insurance really should be using these medicines because we can get those medicines cheaper. And baked into that are many of these biologic preferences. Again, highly controversial, and there's a lot to talk about there, but ultimately the company has decided it's cheaper to go with this biosimilar than the reference product, or this biosimilar compared to that biosimilar. Many times it's worth noting that the patient doesn't really see those cost savings. Sometimes they might. I think another thing is, it's important to understand there are countries or portions of the world where rituximab in its reference form is not readily available, and biosimilars, this idea of biosimilars might improve access. There's multiple products now. In addition, when there's multiple products, there is competition, and competition tends to lower costs. I think it's very early. I've only really been seeing biosimilars be used in the patients that I treat over the last 3 or 4 years. And so it's very early on to see if we're going to actually see some cost savings. But I think we're all hopeful, at least, that the system itself can experience some cost savings, as we know that these biologic therapies are very expensive. I want to kind of just close with some conclusions here. That was a lot of information that I just presented with a lot of definitions, but these are really the takeaways. Biosimilars are safe. They've been approved by the FDA. They have been shown to be highly similar to, and with no clinically meaningful difference between themselves and the reference product. There's expected variance, but it has met the definition of expected variance. They don't have to be studied in every indication, and I think that's an important thing to understand. But they do provide an opportunity for cost savings, at least to the system, at least to the insurance company, and hopefully, in many cases, to the patient themselves. And it's important to understand that the provider must be notified if a biosimilar is being used. I think it's really important to end with a comment that I'm not here to judge whether or not you should be on a biosimilar, or if it's the right thing for you. That discussion is between you and your provider. Many times, my patients, it's a case-by-case discussion. What I don't want, and what I think you should advocate against, is switching back and forth I think the scenario that I hope to never see is that year to year, a single insurance company might preference one biosimilar and then the next year another biosimilar, forcing the patient to kind of switch in between. I think that I would not want to see that right now. I think we need to see more information about switching back and forth before we really get to that level. But it's still very early on, and time will tell if that's going to be an issue or not. But I think going from the reference product to a biosimilar and sticking with that biosimilar is probably a reasonable thing to do. But again, bears discussion with you and your provider. I do want to highlight just a few really important resources. And I really, if anybody's interested in this topic, I think these are vital references. Of course, the Vasculitis Foundation website is important for all things vasculitis. The FDA website, I think, is very accessible at the patient level to really dig into this idea of biosimilars. And then I want to highlight the Creaky Joints patient advocacy group for rheumatoid arthritis and inflammatory arthritis. Many of their patients are on biosimilars because there are more biosimilars available for their medicines. And they have some really good resources, including a nice, Jonathan Kay is the physician that put together some of the resources there. It's a nice handout that goes through a lot of commonly asked questions about biosimilars. So I encourage patients to look at that. I think at this time, Kathy, we can open it up to questions. I'm going to stop sharing so we can see each other. And there we go.
Well, that was great. I have questions that have already been submitted. Some of them you answered, but we might review them a little bit. And I formed a few questions of my own. So I think, and thank you for sharing those resources just now. I think that it's always good for all of us, those of us that are patients, to know the proper places to research these things instead of just what friends share with us or loved ones. Sure. So thank you for sharing that. I think I'll start with, we did talk a little bit about how is a biosimilar the same or different from a biologic, but and also a generic. I think that was the topic of what you were talking about, but I just want to ask if I kind of got this correct, and then maybe you can fix my thinking. I think my understanding is that we've had generics for a long time, and they are, if I got this right, they're something that is almost exactly the same as what the reference drug is. But the biosimilars are now being developed, and they're not, I think what my takeaway is, they seem to be not as, they can be tested in one group, like maybe the biosimilar for Rituxan, I don't know if this is true or not, was tested in a rheumatoid arthritis group, but maybe not an ankylosing group, or that could happen. Is that correct?
Yes, you're exactly right. And, I think we have to understand that generics are really great, right? Because they lower costs dramatically. And because a company can get the cookbook and make the generic exactly the same, and it really drives down cost. If the FDA these companies with these living organisms making the biologics, they're almost like a family recipe. And if the FDA were to hold new companies, company B, to produce the exact same molecule, they would never do it, basically. And because they're so complex, there's so many little variations of the molecules themselves. And so in some sense, the governing bodies have decided that this biosimilar approach is appropriate to try to lower the cost and provide more options, really, because if they were to hold it to the exact molecule, it would never happen, and that company could always have their medicine, and it would always be really expensive. So I think that's the groundwork from which we go. You bring up a really good point that the biosimilars, as it stands, do not have to be tested in every indication. And that does provide some hesitance, I think. That being said, they have been shown in the lab to be highly similar to purity, potency, bioactivity, and then in a subgroup of patients, safe and effective, at least for that indication. And so I think that is enough to say that, it's okay to use, and in the absence of further data. Now, these things are being constantly monitored and constantly studied. I will say the interchangeable product will need to be tested in all the indications. And again, that just it makes it really expensive, which goes against the initial thought of trying to create drugs or products that will lower cost. So I think it's about walking that fine line. Again, in my patients, one switch to a biosimilar, I'm okay with. I've not yet seen a company switch multiple, or an insurance company switch multiple times. And that's what would get me really kind of nervous, because, from the reference product to the biosimilar, if there's a little variance, it's been shown to be at least highly similar to no clinically significant differences. But if you're going from reference product to biosimilar to biosimilar to biosimilar, that variance might end up being important. And I think that is where we need to make sure we're keeping our patients safe. And it's important, again, to know what your patient's getting. I think as long as we're being notified of that by the pharmacy or by the insurance company, we can then decide if it's appropriate or not.
So that brings up a question. I have a version of this in some of the questions that were submitted, but for me, it would be, and might be what most patients are thinking, I guess I didn't know that if my doctor prescribes Rituxan, I might not get Rituxan. Why do I have to? Why the insurance company or gets to decide if I get a biosimilar?
Yeah, write your congressman. This has been happening for a long time, and for the most common scenario is actually an inflammatory arthritis, like rheumatoid arthritis, where an insurance company might have a preference for a particular reference product compared to another reference product. I guess to put some specifics there, they might preference adalimumab, which is Humira, versus etanercept, which is a totally different molecule and known as Imbral. And I'm just it's a hypothetical, theoretical type of situation there. So rheumatologists and patients for a long time have actually been battling insurance companies about which product they might use. And again, highly controversial. There's a lot of cooks in the kitchen on that. And it really comes down to insurance companies having contracts functionally with different products, and they can get it cheaper. But it is frustrating. It's very frustrating that that the insurance companies, pharmacy benefit managers, are the ones kind of involved in which medicine is appropriate for the patient. Their end of it really is about cost. They are trying to keep the cost down, which is admirable. But that cost savings really, we really need to hold them accountable and make them, share that cost savings with the patient.
Well, that definitely explains it. I don't think I understood that before today. I know that sometimes I would get generics in place of something that I had previously taken. And, for the most part, my doctors were okay with that. I didn't understand that about biosimilars. But one of the questions that also came up with this was a patient said, I'm having difficulty with insurance covering a biosimilar. And I have seen that in some of our social media groups. Do you know why that is?
Well, without knowing the specifics of that specific situation, what I imagine is that an insurance company, the doctor said you're going to continue rituximab, or we're going to prescribe rituximab, and the insurance company has a preference for kind of which rituximab, and there's some delay or just difficulty. I think this is a really challenging situation because ANCA vasculitis, as you know, can be life-threatening, can be organ-threatening. We don't need to delay therapy. And so the patient and the provider are caught in this narrow zone of really, I think there is a scenario where a patient and a provider can go to the insurance company and say, no, I don't want them to have the biosimilar. I want them to have the reference product. That opens up a situation where the insurance company might not cover it as well. So it might be more expensive. And undoubtedly, that process will take some time, causing a delay in therapy. And so I think, again, we're just operating in this narrow zone of trying to get our patients the therapy that they need. And I think we have to be careful. I mean, there's this saying, the perfect is the enemy of the good. And I think in without data that these biosimilars are harmful, I think they're okay to use, but I think we need to be very careful and monitor them very carefully and make sure the patients are tolerating them, make sure they're being effective the way we think they're going to be effective. And that really comes down to the individual level in the office. So the insurance portion is very difficult, and I think it's just important for patients to understand that it does take time if we're going to kind of fight a process. It's called a prior approval process. And sometimes that might result in a situation where the medicine is not covered as well. So unfortunately, we're in a situation where we have to we're not bending to the insurance companies, but I mean, because their decisions are made from a place of knowing that these molecules are highly similar to and no clinically meaningful difference. And without good evidence to use something else, that they're likely okay to be used. I will say this, an insurance company, all of these products, we're going to talk about rituximab specifically. All of these should be subject to patent law issues. Your company should give you access to a medicine that's FDA approved for the disease that you have. And so if you find out they're not covering a rituximab or a rituximab biosimilar for ANCA-associated vasculitis, that could be an issue, and that needs to be evaluated.
Yeah, I think this is all very hard for the patients to understand. It almost sounds like if you get a biosimilar, it would be because your insurance company wants you to have that, not because your doctor wants you to have that. So I don't understand why they wouldn't cover a biosimilar if they're the ones making that decision. That's what confused me about the question. So,
yeah, and I think, sorry to interrupt, but I think that's probably the issue, is that just some confusion about, because they're all called rituximab, right? And so
yeah.
I think unless you're speaking in very specific terms, they probably are preferencing a biosimilar, which is rituximab in their mind and in the FDA's mind. But the patient understands they're not getting the drug that they were getting specifically, right, which they knew as maybe rituximab. So I think there's probably a communication issue on some level, on a misunderstanding like that.
Well, I mean, that's good to know also, because that could clear up a situation for somebody. The similar question that came along with this is, will the pharmaceuticals offer patient assistance to help with the cost of biosimilars? Because they do that on some of the reference products.
Right. They should, and most do, is the answer. I encourage a patient, and Creaky Joints does this as well. If you find a company is not offering a patient assistance program, you need to notify one of these patient advocacy groups and let us see what we can do. Because, ultimately it's about cost and access. And if our patients can't get access to the medications that they need to treat their disease, then we need to know about that.
Right. I do every once in a while on social media see some nightmare story of this huge number, and somebody always advises them to go to Creaky Joints or something like that to get some help. So that's great to know. One patient also says, I heard there are synthetic substances in biosimilars that will that have a long-term effect on my body?
I guess the honest answer is I don't know. A more detailed answer is, I think about it like different ingredients in this complex recipe to produce the bread. Some folks might, keeping with the bread analogy, might prefer this yeast or that yeast. So again, I think you can rest assured that ultimately the FDA has approved it on the basis of it being highly similar to, with no clinically significant differences. But yes, there can be differences in the little buffers and the chemistry of the drug itself. But again, that is a product of how complex these molecules are, in an effort to keep them stable and workable in the conditions in the human body. Most of them have to be stored in a refrigerator, things like that. So I think I'm willing to give the companies the benefit of the doubt in some sense to keep things safe. And again, these are medicines that have been studied in humans. The biosimilars have maybe not every indication, but humans. And so they do and they're doing safety and efficacy data. So the safety data, I think, is the important part in a question like this, to know that there haven't been any there can't be clinically significant differences, or else they couldn't label it as a biosimilar.
And I think you actually just touched on this one, and you did cover it when you were speaking, but I just want to reiterate that somebody asked, is the process for approving biosimilars identical to FDA approval of biosimilars?
Yeah, it's not identical, but it's still highly rigorous in the context of what the drug is. So I think, again, it's much like generics don't have to be tested in every indication, right? I mean, ibuprofen, acetaminophen hasn't been tested in all these different groups. There aren't trials, but it's because the FDA can verify, basically beyond a shadow of a doubt, that the molecules are exactly the same. So why wouldn't they? That being said, companies will use different, and patients know this too, if they've ever had a reaction to a name or a generic and they need the name brand because of whatever's mixed into the pill. It's a very similar issue here with the biosimilars, but the FDA process, I mean, it's highly regulated. I think patients can rest assured that it's rigorous and highly regulated, third party, and looking out for the safety of the patients.
Well, that's great. I think, my takeaway today from this is that I feel much more comfortable about biosimilars. I feel like I understand the difference between a biosimilar and a generic, which all these terms are overwhelming to a patient. And I do not have a science brain. And I think you explained it in such a great way today that makes me understand that, number one, that it's not usually my doctor's choice that I would get a biosimilar. And I didn't know that. And that I do know that I've had doctors before when we ordered, say, Rituxan, and we got a generic form of it. First of all, I didn't know Rituxan was the reference product and rituximab. I never understood the difference between the two names. So thank you for explaining that. But I understand that sometimes my doctor orders Rituxan and I get a generic and it works fine for me, or I have some reaction and we move back to the reference drug if necessary. It's good to know that that's what the doctor's intentions are, because I'm not sure all the patients knew that. And I appreciate those clarifications today.
Yeah, of course. I think that's it's good to hear. This is, again, highly complex topic. So I encourage patients, if they're more interested in this, that they go to the creakyjoints.org and look at those resources they have. They're immense resources to further educate yourself.
Well, thank you. I think this, like I said, I think this was great. And we really appreciate you, Dr. Kevin Byram, for coming on today and making biosimilars an easy thing to understand for patients. Also this year, watch for more webinars on biosimilars. So we've gotten, level 101 explanation today, and we should have more in the future.